Fashion may seem like something a bit superficial. You're looking at calico prints from India that were popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, or Madras prints that are still popular in the Caribbean today, the Savile Row suits, or maybe the Nehru jacket that was popular for a while in the 50s and 60s, or even today, the cashmere sweaters that are so popular. It's fun, but is it something that you could make some real history with? Could you reconstruct the entire history of a country purely by following the fashion choices? Maybe. Stay tuned as we follow the history of the British decolonization of India in 1947. In a previous video, I covered World War II and decolonization, and I made some general comments. One, the decolonization movement applied mostly to Britain and France, the two largest colonial powers of their time. Two, the decolonization movement happened first in Asia from the mid-40s to mid-50s, and then after that in Africa from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. Three, some cases of decolonization were rather peaceful, and that was actually mostly the case, but in other cases, you had wars of decolonization. Well, starting today, we'll have a few case studies, and we'll start with British India. It is relevant for the British Empire, also a good example of the early wave of decolonization in Asia, and it's a prime example of a peaceful form of decolonization. So why would the Indians want to break free from England in the first place? If you listen to the English colonizers of the 19th century, or even some British historians today, there was much to be celebrated with the British rule in India. The British came along, spread the English language and English common laws, thus united an area that was beset by a lot of differences, linguistic and otherwise. The British built railroads and great monuments, many of which are still standing in India today, and they combated some pretty barbaric practices like the burning of widows. So why would the Indians be so ungrateful as to kick the British out? Well, because they looked at a number of less savory aspects of English colonization. And we had a video on the British colonization of India, so refer yourself to that for the full picture. But here's a condensed version of everything that was wrong about the British in India. For one thing, they were not invited. They came in and conquered India. And in 1857, you have a great mutiny by mercenaries called the Great Sepoy Mutiny, with the Indians trying to kick out the British from India, and failed. The economic record was also mixed. When the British came along, it was to trade spices and textiles and raise taxes and make money. In some cases, it could be downright exploitative. You have some British agents of the East India Company in the early ages of the British colonization, the so-called nabob, that would come in, make a killing in the Indian market, and then retire rich. Another impact that would be greatly felt was in the textile industry, where India used to be quite famous for its production of textile, things like calico print, or maybe the Madras print that you'll find all over the Caribbean. Well, in the 19th century, as the British took over India, they pretty much wiped out the Indian textile industry. Instead, the Indians would be expected to produce raw cotton that cannot be grown in Britain, export bales of cotton, and then re-import the finished product. And so if you ask yourself how come India missed the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, part of it has to do with the British colonization effort during that period. Beyond that, much of the British rule of India was centered on the notion of racial prejudice, that the white man knows best, and he has to carry the white man's burden, to use the words of Rudyard Kipling, one of these Englishmen in India. And that became quite obvious in the case of the Ilbert Bill in the 1880s, where for a while there is some discussion within England as to whether the judges that are qualified enough in India, brown judges of Indian descent, could rule in any case if they are qualified enough. And many white colonists in India just grew adamant about that, saying, I don't care that those Indians are well qualified enough, I cannot have a brown judge in a case where a white Englishman would be a plaintiff or a defendant. And so you have a segregated court system that really exposed the racial nature of British rule in India. And that had an impact in eventually convincing many Indians to create an independence national movement through the Indian National Congress, which was a main movement toward independence. It's not a Congress in the sense of like the US Congress where they could actually pass laws. It's more a party, a gathering of people that were opposed to a British rule. Many members of the Indian National Congress tended to be rather elite Indians, people that had suffered from the destruction of the textile industry, from the business community, or people that had tried to embrace the English colonial movement, had been educated, and then I realized after the Ilbert Bill controversy that they would never be accepted within England just by virtue of the color of their skin. The independence movement of India got even more momentum during World War I. During that time, India contributed quite a few troops to the British war effort. Some of them fought in Mesopotamia against the Ottoman Empire, some of them fought in East Africa against the German colony of Tanzania, and some of them went all the way to the Western Front in Europe. They fought bravely, shed a lot of blood, and after World War I, like many colonial troops from France and Britain, they expected to get some payback in the sense of maybe greater autonomy, and they got pretty much zip. So that led to much resentment, especially since by World War I, you had that idea floating around in the air, the concept of self-determination, that was put forward by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, the notion that people have a right to govern themselves. So all these ideas are floating around by 1918, the end of World War I. That led to a major demonstration in the city of Amritsar in 1919, where thousands of Indians demonstrated, among other things, for greater autonomy for India. The British response, specifically by General Dyer, D-Y-E-R, was to put a bunch of troops in front of the demonstration and then ordered his troops to shoot into unarmed civilians. This led to a major massacre, the so-called Amritsar massacre of 1919. The death toll is still in dispute, for sure hundreds of dead, maybe even thousands. What happened to Dyer? Well, he got some criticism back in Britain, but never got the full court-martial and punishment that his murderous actions really deserved, at least as far as the Indians were concerned. So what about the person that would lead that movement for India toward independence? That's where the famous Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, also known as the Mahatma Gandhi, would come along. You probably know about him already. He is the most famous person to ever come out of India. In fact, he's one of the great figures of world history in the 20th century. Just a digression for a bit. In 2000, when Time magazine decided to select their person of the year, as they do every year, they figure let's get a person of the century as well. And they debated whether to take one of the bad guys like Stalin or Hitler or one of the good guys like Einstein and Gandhi got the second notch right behind Einstein, almost became the most important figure of the 20th century per Time magazine. So what's so important about him? He came from India, obviously. He was a member of one of the upper castes in India. And according to the Hindu religion in India, you are born into a caste based on the principle of reincarnation. And there are sharp differences from the highest caste, which would be the Brahmins, all the way to the lowest of the low, below the lowest caste, the so-called untouchables. Gandhi was not a Brahmin, but he came from one of the upper castes, rather privileged as a child. Well, privileged up to a certain point. He and his wife got married in a way that was an arranged marriage very early on. He must have been 13 or 14 at the time. But still privileged. He got to study in England as a young man. He studied the law, and that's why you see him in that dapper suit, looking very smart, like a proper English lawyer ought to be. After he got his law degree, he moved to South Africa, which was another segment of the British colonial empire. And South Africa is a distinct dominion because it had a significant white minority. Some of them were descendants of the Dutch settlers from way back when. They were the so-called Boers or Afrikaners, and then you also had some British settlers that had come along. Beyond them, they had a significant minority of Indian immigrants, just like Gandhi, also some mixed race people, and then the vast bulk of the population would be Africans that are black Africans, say Zulu, for example. And even though people of color would be the majority of the population, they would be placed very low in the social system. This was known as apartheid, pretty much keeping the races apart. And that was true up until the 1990s. In that system, there was a strict segregation of how you were supposed to interact, marry, or in that case, not marry. Pretty much just like the Jim Crow laws that you had in the US South up until the 1960s, but on steroids. That was a rude awakening to Gandhi, who was a bit of an idealist and who thought that England was all about common law and equality between the races. And when he got there, there's a famous incident where he tried to board a first-class compartment in a train, and he deserved to be there. He had bought a ticket and everything, and he was just kicked out purely on the basis of his brown skin. And it's at that time that he really became politically aware, started to fight against discrimination, apartheid in South Africa, and then eventually decided to go back to his native India to take on the big fight, the fight for independence. So once you've settled on getting independence, how do you achieve that? Many places in the world have tried to pick up a gun and fight. That would be the case, for example, of this country, the American War of Independence. Gandhi had different ideas. Part of it is inspired from the nonviolent nature of a number of religions from India, Buddhism, Jainism, and part of it just reflects his own thinking. That became satyagraha, principle of nonviolence, which is really key in world history because it would then be borrowed by, say, Martin Luther King in the United States, who was a great admirer of Gandhi. Or we talked about apartheid. Later on, Nelson Mandela also borrowed from Gandhi. So really an influential person in that sense. So how do you work nonviolence? How do you convince a powerful empire like the British Empire to give away the crown jewel of the empire, India? Well, the method of nonviolence might include things like civil disobedience, where you refuse to obey laws that you consider to be unfair. Not all the laws. If there's a red light that says you should stop at the intersection, otherwise there will be a car accident, obviously you obey those laws, but those that you find to be unfair. So if there are segregationist laws in the US South that say that black and white people can't sit together at the lunch counter, well, break that law and have white customers going to the black area of the restaurant and black customers going to the white area of the restaurant. Or if there's another law that said that black patrons cannot sit in the same area of the bus as white people, well, break that law, as Rosa Parks famously did. And if the governor of Alabama, George Corley Wallace, is telling you that you cannot march peacefully across Peters Bridge in Selma, Alabama to demand voting rights, well, go ahead and do it anyway. If you break those laws, say demonstrate even though you were prevented from doing it, you're going to be arrested and sent to prison. And in that regard, the world record holder might be Nelson Mandela in South Africa. When he demanded the end of apartheid, he was sent to prisons like Robben Island and spent 27 years of his life there breaking rocks in the blinding sun until he finally was released, got to run for president of South Africa, and then got elected. Even better, he got to star in a movie played by Morgan Freeman. What you can do is to fast at that point, and Gandhi was famous for the long periods of fasting that he did in his life. So what do you do as an English jailer? Do you let him die in your hands? And he's a very famous person who never injured anybody. So in that case, you'll have his blood on your hands. You don't want to do that. Not the British Empire of the 20th century that's starting to become a bit more liberal and more attuned to notions of civil rights and human rights. So ultimately, after a while, you just let him go and then repeat the process of getting into trouble again, getting arrested, fasting, getting released, and that puts the issue on the front burner all the time. So you're not inflicted pain on the adversary, but you gain the high moral ground, which is very important. Just like, say, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders trying to go across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. You don't actually win the battle that day against the National Guard of Alabama. But the very fact that you got beaten up, and this makes the national news, means that you gain the high moral ground and the other guys look like the bad guys, which would never have happened if you had fought back against the police. So that was a genius idea that you can trace back to Gandhi. One quick note, if you are a young political activist trying to use nonviolence as a weapon, it does not always work. What you need ahead of you is an adversary who actually cares about public opinion. And that's not always the case. In 1981, several Irish Republican activists who were trying to bring attention to the plight of North Ireland went on hunger strike when they were in prison in Great Britain. Their plight attracted attention all around the world. One of them, Bobby Sands, was even elected Member of Parliament in Great Britain during the strike. Except on the other side was a famous Iron Lady of Great Britain, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She could care less. And after 2 months of hunger strikes, 10 of the prisoners simply starved themselves to death, and then the survivors simply called off the strike. So it does not always work. Another notion that would be important would be that of boycott. Since the British were often in India to make money, if you can hit them in the pocketbook, that's going to help. One thing that the Indians had to do was to pay a tax on salt. And so famously, Gandhi led a march to the sea, which is not at all like Sherman in the Civil War. It's a very peaceful demonstration where you march all the way to the Arabian Sea or the Indian Ocean, and then you collect salt and you make salt. Another good that you could boycott would be English-made textiles. So now you don't wear those fancy lawyer suits from England. Instead, you make your own cotton. And you see often Gandhi next to a cotton wheel, where he's turning the raw cotton from India into yarn, or next to a loom, where we turn that yarn into homespun cotton. Ultimately, the Indian National Congress encompassed more than just Gandhi. Two other famous leaders would be Nehru and then Ali Jinnah, and I'll get back to them in a second. I just want to notice in passing that Nehru was famous for a very specific cut of a jacket, and that's where we get the Nehru jacket. It's named after him. Very popular in the 50s and 60s with people like, say, the Beatles from Britain. So getting back to the path toward independence, by the 1940s, England was hit again, this time by World War II. And the Japanese in Southeast Asia were able to take over several British colonies, Singapore, Malaysia most famously, moving to Burma, and then for a while almost threatened India, and tried to extend a hand to British independence fighters to say, well, if you revolt and you ally yourself with the Japanese army, maybe we could kick the British out. And Britain was really with its back to the wall around 1942-43. And so during World War II, England really did not look like it was able to defend India. And that's the time when the Indian independence movement kicked into high gear with what was known as the Quit India movement. And so by 1945, when England emerged victorious from World War II, but also broke, they began that fire sale of the empire, where they kind of disbanded the empire in just a matter of years. And India was one of the first colonies to go, 1947. The big issue that was still left outstanding was, what do you do with India after independence? Do you have one single united India that would be a very large country, or do you split it along sectarian lines? Because you had a significant Muslim minority within India. And that Muslim minority would be especially concentrated around what is today Pakistan to the northwest and Bangladesh to the east. So potentially you could do what was called partition, where you split the country in two, one that would be mostly Muslim and one mostly Hindu. The leaders of the Indian National Congress were very divided about that. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Muslim leader that I mentioned earlier, he wanted partition. So did Jawaharlal Nehru, the one with the Nehru jacket. He also wanted partition, partly because they thought it would be easier to rule the country that was more religiously united, and partly, I think, because they thought this would provide two jobs. And not surprisingly, after independence, Muhammad Ali Jinnah became the first Muslim Prime Minister of Pakistan, and Nehru the first Hindu Prime Minister of India. As for Gandhi, however, he was adamant that the whole country of India should remain united. He thought of India as being rich because of its diversity, that you not only had Muslims and Hindus, but Jains and Christians and Sikh, and people speaking dozens of languages, and that's what made India great. That's not a source of weakness. He figured that it would be difficult to actually draw a line of partition because there were Muslims kind of all over India, more of them in some areas, but all over, and same thing with Hindus. So no matter what happened, you would have people that would be in kind of the wrong side of the border. So to prove that it would be possible for Indians to live together, he resorted to ashrams, A-S-H-R-A-M. Which is like a hippie commune, and that's another thing that in the 50s, 60s was very popular with more like the hippie generation in the West. So that commune, in the case of India, would involve creating a little hamlet kind of thing, where you would have people that were from high caste and lower caste, from Hindu background and Sikh background and Hindu background. And you would all live in harmony together while sharing the tasks. The people that are below the lowest caste, what are often called untouchable in the West, though the term has become slightly offensive in India today, would be those who traditionally in India would be in charge of the dirty things, like cleaning the latrine or handling the dead or cremation or tannery, anything involving filth and the dead. Well, in the ashram, everybody will be equal. It's not just the untouchable that will take care of cleaning the bathroom, but the Brahmin, one day of the week, will be in charge of that. So that you would create an egalitarian kind of India, almost a socialist utopia. But more importantly, show that you can live together equally. Because it's very difficult to make an argument to the English, you are being racist, you don't treat us equally, if within the country itself you have such sharp social divisions, and the Brahmin are also treating the untouchables like dirt. Let's learn to live together in that small community ashram, and if we succeed at that, then that proves that altogether in India, we can do that as well. Ergo, we don't need partition. There's really a mystical aspect to Gandhi that we can't forget. He's a political figure, but also kind of a spiritual leader. I mentioned earlier that he had gotten married very young to his wife. Well, at some point as an adult, he decided that he would take a vow of chastity. and never have sex for the rest of his life, which incidentally meant that his wife had taken a vow of chastity as well, whether she wanted to or not. And he might sleep with a very young, allured woman, naked, just to make a point that he would overcome his desire to have sex with her and just prove that his mind was stronger than his flesh. I'm not sure what his wife had to say about that. In the end, it was the British that made the decision as to what to do with India, and they settled for partition. So one British official had to kind of cut India in two, and he compared his task to that of a butcher, because they figured wherever I do the line of partition, there will be blood on either side of the blade. So independence came in 1947, and again, it's two countries, one that we call India today, and the other one called Pakistan, which back then included Bangladesh as well. And that's where the peaceful nature of the Indian decolonization movement kind of shifted a bit, because there were a lot of massacres right after independence. Many of the Muslims living in Pakistan told their Hindu neighbors, well, now you're in a country that's mostly Muslim, what are you doing here? Why don't you go to Hindu India? And within Hindu India, you have the reverse process of Hindu nationalists turning against Muslims. And I'm talking about people that had lived there for centuries. And somehow they turn against one another. So you had hundreds of thousands of deaths. And so many of these deaths that the survivors just took to the streets to march all the way to, say, Pakistan if you are Muslim. And that migration that eventually involved millions of people became one of the most massive migrations in all of human history. So that added a very sad touch to what was supposed to be a joyous celebration of independence. Gandhi was really distraught by that, so much so that he announced that he would do yet another fast. That was the one way that he knew how to act, that he would refuse to feed himself as long as there were violence going on within India. And after a few days and weeks, people started really wondering, well, will he die? And that's the whole point, that if you are killing your neighbor, then in a way you are killing Gandhi, because he will not feed himself as long as there is sectarian violence in India. I always thought what would happen if I, Professor Durand, decided to stop feeding myself until there was world peace and an end to terrorism and conflict here and there. I have a pretty strong feeling that I would starve to death because nobody would care. Well, in the case of Gandhi, he had such a stature within India, both among Muslims and Hindus, that this did a lot to eventually abate the violence, get it to slow down, and then bring peace back to India, which is one of the most remarkable events ever to happen in history. One person, purely through the strength of character and example, able to bring peace to a subcontinent. That story, unfortunately, has a sad coda, because in 1948, right after independence, Gandhi was shot by some assassin. The big fear at that point was, well, if the assassin happens to be Muslim and Gandhi is Hindu, that will restart a whole cycle of violence and mayhem will ensue. Thankfully, that assassin happened to be a Hindu nationalist who was angry that Gandhi was too cozy with Muslims, and so there was kind of an intra-Hindu violence, so that did not start another wave of massacres. So why does that matter today? Because that's the whole point of history, right? We study the past so that we know what happens today. Well, there's a lot of impact. Well, obviously that's why we have India today and Pakistan, but it's also why we have a conflict between those two countries. The conflicts have taken place a lot along the northern border, not too far from the province of Kashmir, and that's where we bring the sweaters. The sweaters are usually spelled Kashmere, and they're named after the goats of that region. But the province, which is usually spelled Kashmir, is a disputed province at the foothill of the Himalayas that both Pakistan and India claim. And you've had several wars over the few decades since independence over the status of Kashmir. In fact, I taped this in early 2019, and we just emerged from a very big period of tension between India and Pakistan. They almost went to war with the matter, which would be a bit scary because in the late 90s, both India and Pakistan developed a nuclear bomb. So if a major war did break out, this could potentially involve the exchange of several nuclear bombs in one of the most densely populated areas of the world. So finger crossed there. Another one of the conflict between India and Pakistan was about Bangladesh, because initially Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. You had West Pakistan, and then all the way tucked in the corner, East Pakistan, the same way that, say, the US has the lower 48 states, and then Alaska does not have any territorial contiguity. So Bangladesh resented being the ugly stepchild in the corner and wanted to break away from Pakistan. Pakistan refused. That led to a war in 1971. India, being smack in the middle, got dragged into it, and pretty much anything that's bad for the enemy, Pakistan, is good for India, so they sided with Bangladesh. And with the help of India, Bangladesh became independent in 1971. And that's why you have two countries nowadays, Pakistan and Bangladesh, in addition to India. So you see a lot of things that you see on the map, there is some history behind it. That's why you should study all of that. And study the fashion, because we now know that there's a connection between the British suits of Gandhi and the Nehru jacket and the calico print and the cashmere sweaters. Well, that's it for today. Next time we'll study another case of decolonization, a very different one. It will be in French Algeria, and this one will be quite a bit more violent. Stay tuned.